The silence that fell over the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas on that Sunday morning in the autumn of 1882 was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made your heart feel too large for your chest. Every single soul in that whitewashed building, from Reverend Elias Marsh standing rigid at his pulpit to the widow Hanratty clutching her pearl rosary in the third pew, turned in unison toward the back of the church, because Owen Hunter had just risen from his seat. Owen Hunter never came to church. He had not set foot inside this building in 3 years, not since the day they buried his wife Clara in the churchyard out back, and he walked away from God and polite society with equal contempt. The man who stood now at the rear of the congregation was enormous, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and grief and years of deliberate solitude. His jaw was set like iron. His dark eyes swept the room once, cutting through the morning light that slanted through the tall windows, and then they found exactly what they were looking for. They found Nora Donnelly. She was seated in the second row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her dark auburn hair pinned beneath a modest hat the color of sage brush. She had been listening to Reverend Marsh speak about the virtue of community, about the sacred duty neighbors owed to one another, and she had not heard a word of it because her mind had been consumed, as it always was, as it had been for 6 agonizing weeks, with the question of what she was going to do when the bank came for her land on Friday. She felt the shift in the room before she understood it. She turned, and she saw Owen Hunter standing there, and her breath left her body. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had made a decision, and was not going to be moved from it by the gaze of 80 assembled neighbors. His boots struck the wooden floorboards with a rhythmic certainty. He stopped 3 feet behind her pew, and he spoke her name. He spoke it in a voice that was low and rough and absolutely certain, the kind of voice that did not ask permission, the kind of voice that had been practicing saying this one thing for longer than he wanted anyone to know. Nora Donnelly, she stood. She did not know why she stood. Her body simply rose to meet the moment the way water rises in a flood, inevitable and unstoppable. He looked at her for a long beat, and the whole church held its breath, and then Owen Hunter spoke 4 more words in that same rough, irrevocable voice, and those 4 words detonated through the room like a charge of black powder, sending everything that had come before them up in smoke. "I intend to marry you." Now the silence shattered entirely. Now the widow Hanratty made a sound like a startled hen. Now Reverend Marsh gripped his pulpit. Now the man in the first pew, the man who had been making Nora Donnelly's life a particular variety of hell for 6 weeks, the man who had engineered the circumstances that threatened to take everything from her, went very, very still. And Nora Donnelly, who had not cried once since her father died, who had not allowed herself the luxury of fear or softness or desperation, felt something crack open inside her chest like a fault line giving way. But the story of how Owen Hunter came to say those words, and what those words meant, and what it cost them both to get there, that story began 6 weeks earlier, on the day that Nora Donnelly arrived in Caldwell, Kansas with a carpetbag, a secret, and a name that was about to become very inconvenient for a number of powerful men. She had come from St. Louis by train and then by stagecoach, and the journey had taken 4 days and had stripped away every illusion she had carried about what the frontier looked like from a distance. Up close it was dust and sky, vast and indifferent and extraordinary. She had pressed her face to the coach window somewhere in southern Kansas, and felt for the first time in her 26 years that the world was genuinely bigger than her grief. That was something, at least. Her father, Patrick Donnelly, had come to Kansas 17 years before she did. He had written to her every month without fail, letters full of the particular exuberant hope that men get when they are doing something difficult and calling it freedom. He had built a ranch on 300 acres east of Caldwell, raised cattle, survived droughts and blizzards and the constant threat of the land itself, And then he had died of a fever in July of 1882 with his boots off and his hands folded and his affairs, as Nora discovered when his lawyer's letter reached her, in a condition of spectacular disorder. She had inherited the ranch. She had also inherited a mortgage held by the Caldwell Savings and Trust Company, a mortgage that had been modified and extended and renegotiated until it bore almost no resemblance to the original document her father had signed in 1871, and which now, according to the bank's interpretation of the final amendment, was due in full in 60 days from the date of Patrick Donnelly's death. The lawyer who wrote that letter was a man named Silas Crane. He operated out of a narrow office on Main Street in Caldwell, and he was also, as Nora would discover, the personal attorney for the majority shareholder of the Caldwell Savings and Trust Company. That majority shareholder was a man named Harlan Brock, and Harlan Brock, as the people of Caldwell well knew and carefully never said out loud, wanted the Donnelly land with a desperation that had the texture of something darker than mere greed. Nora did not know any of this when she stepped off the stagecoach into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in early September. She knew only that her father had left her a ranch and that she intended to keep it. The town of Caldwell in 1882 was a border town, sitting right on the line between Kansas and Indian Territory, and it had the electric, unstable energy of a place where everything was still being decided. The cattle drives that had made it famous were shifting north, and the town was in the complicated process of trying to figure out what it wanted to be. There were good families there, church-going people who built schoolhouses and planted kitchen gardens and argued about the proper way to conduct a territorial election. There were also men like Harlan Brock, who had arrived early enough and stayed ruthless enough to accumulate the kind of wealth that could purchase almost anything, including legal interpretations and the silence of neighbors. Nora walked from the stage stop to the lawyer's office with her carpetbag and her back straight and her jaw set, and Silas Crane looked her over with the particular expression of a man who has decided in advance that he will not be impressed, and he laid out the situation with the crisp efficiency of someone delivering news they have delivered before. The mortgage was due in 60 days. The amount was $4,200. If it was not paid, the bank would foreclose. There was, Crane mentioned with the careful neutrality of a man who knew his own guilt, a buyer interested in the property. The buyer was prepared to offer a fair price. The name of the buyer he kept tactfully vague, but Nora was not a fool, and she understood instinctively that a fair price from an unnamed buyer who appeared before she had even unpacked her bag was not a coincidence. She told Crane she would think about it. She walked out of his office into the September sunlight, and she stood on the boardwalk of Main Street in Caldwell, Kansas for a full minute, breathing the dusty air, looking at the wide sky, and making a decision that would define everything that followed. She was not going to sell. She found the ranch by following the directions the stage driver gave her, riding in a borrowed wagon with a taciturn young man named Pete who worked at the livery, and had agreed to drive her for 50 cents. The road east of town wound through grassland that was going gold at the edges with the early autumn, and then it dropped down into a shallow valley where a creek ran clear over flat stones, and there was the house her father had built. It was a low, solid structure of timber and sod, nothing grand, but it faced south and the porch caught the afternoon light, and there were 3 cottonwood trees in the yard that her father must have planted young because they were still slender, and there was a barn that needed paint, and 200 acres of grazing land that rolled away to the east under a sky so enormous it felt like a physical pressure. She sat in that borrowed wagon, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was trying to save, and then she thanked Pete and paid him and watched him drive away, and she went inside and lit the stove and made herself a cup of coffee from the tin on the shelf, and she sat at her father's table and looked at his handwriting on the calendar on the wall, July entries trailing off mid-month. A man's life interrupted, and she was very, very close to crying. But she did not. She spent the first week learning what she had. A foreman named Gus Whitfield, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for her father for 8 years and seemed to view Nora's arrival as a complicated personal inconvenience, informed her that there were 60 head of cattle on the property, a small herd by any measure, and that the fall roundup would need to happen within the next month if she wanted them trailed to the railhead at Caldwell for sale before winter. He also informed her, with the neutral tone of a man repeating information he considers obvious, that 60 head at current market prices would bring in roughly $900, which was considerably less than the $4,200 she owed. She asked him about a loan. He told her the only bank in the county was the Caldwell Savings and Trust, and he said the name of the bank with a particular flatness that communicated, without stating, that this avenue was not available to her. She asked him about other ranchers who might be willing to buy into a partnership arrangement. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon the way men in the West always seem to be looking at the horizon, as if the answer might come riding in from a distance. He said the name Owen Hunter the way you say the name of someone you are not sure is going to come up well in conversation. Owen Hunter, Gus told her, owned the largest ranch in the county, the Broken H, which ran adjacent to the Donnelly property on the north and west. Owen Hunter had been ranching in Caldwell County since 1874, had built his operation up from 200 acres to 1,200 through patience and hard work, and the kind of intelligence that did not announce itself. He was also, Gus said, the kind of man who kept to himself with a ferocity that bordered on hostility, who had not been friendly with the town since his wife died 3 years ago, and who would be more likely to spit at a partnership offer than accept one. Nora said she would like to meet him. Gus looked at her with an expression that suggested he was revising his initial assessment of her intelligence downward. She met Owen Hunter on a Wednesday, not through any arrangement or introduction, but because she found him on her land. She had ridden out early to inspect the eastern pasture, alone, on a copper-colored mare named Alice that Gus had picked for her from her father's small string of horses. She came over a low rise and found a man on horseback at the creek, inspecting the fence line where the Donnelly property bordered the Broken H. He was working methodically, moving along the fence with one hand and testing each post, and he did not hear her approach until she was close enough to see that the fence had been cut and repaired recently by the look of the wire and that this man was the one who had repaired it. She said, "That's Donnelly land you're working on." He turned and looked at her with dark eyes under the brim of a battered hat, and his face was all plains and shadows, a hard face, not unkind but not warm, a face that had spent too much time outdoors and too much time alone. He appeared to be somewhere in his mid-30s, though the set of him added years in a way that had nothing to do with age. He said cattle were getting through, yours and mine both. He said it simply, stating fact, not apologizing. "How long has that fence been cut?" she asked. "About 2 weeks," he said, "since before your father died." She looked at the repaired posts and thought about the implications of a fence that had been cut on the border between two properties, right around the time her father was sick and dying. She looked at Owen Hunter's face and decided with the quick instinct she had always trusted that he had not cut it. She said, "I'm Nora Donnelly," he said. "I know who you are." He did not offer his name, but she already knew it. She said, "I'm keeping the ranch." Something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise exactly, but it was close. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he said, "That'll be difficult," with a bluntness that was not unsympathetic. She said, "I expect it will. That doesn't change my plan." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded once briefly, the way people nod when they have registered something they are not ready to respond to yet, and he turned back to his horse. She rode back to the ranch, with the feeling of having been assessed by someone who did not assess lightly. She did not see him again for 2 weeks, but she heard about him constantly in the way that small communities narrate their own people to newcomers. She heard about his wife Clara, who had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1879 and left him with no children and a grief that had calcified into solitude. She heard about his reputation as a man of absolute fairness in any dealing, his contempt for Harlan Brock, his wartime service. He had fought for the Union in Virginia at an age that made the mathematics of it sobering. She heard from the woman who ran the boarding house where she took her meals that Owen Hunter had spoken to the circuit judge about the legality of the Donnelly mortgage modification before Nora had even arrived in Caldwell, and that the circuit judge had told him it was a matter for the courts. That particular piece of information made her set down her fork and stare at the tablecloth for a long moment. Why would Owen Hunter, who had no stake in the Donnelly ranch and no apparent interest in her welfare, involve himself in the legal status of her father's debt before she arrived? She turned the question over for several days without finding an answer she was satisfied with, and then she did what she had always done when a problem resisted her first approaches. She went at it directly. She rode to the Broken H on a Tuesday morning and knocked on the front door of a house that was large and well-built and utterly devoid of any decorative softness, the house of a man who lived in its rooms without caring much about them. Owen Hunter opened the door in his work clothes, looked at her with the same dark, measuring gaze she remembered from the creek, and stepped back to let her in without a word. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke and horses in a way that was not unpleasant. There was a stone fireplace, a heavy table, shelves of ledger books and what she suspected were law books. There was a small daguerreotype on the mantel that she did not look at directly. She sat across from him at the table and she said without preamble, "I understand you spoke to Judge Carter about my father's mortgage." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at her steadily. He said, "I did." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the modification was made 4 months before your father died, when he was already sick, and the terms of it bear a strong resemblance to an agreement Harlan Brock used twice before to acquire land from people who couldn't pay the accelerated debt." She felt the cold clarity of confirmed suspicion. She said, "You've seen him do this before." He said, "The Hessler place in 1878, the Ramirez family in 1880. He said the names flatly, the way you say the names of things that have already happened and cannot be undone, but that sit with you regardless. She said, "And nobody stopped him." He said, "The Hesslers took his offer. The Ramirez family, he stopped." He said after a moment, "They didn't have good options." She understood what that meant. She also understood, looking at this man across his table, that he carried the weight of those 2 failures with him, that they were part of the hardness in his face. She said, "What did Judge Carter tell you?" He said, "That if the modification was signed under duress or without full legal understanding of the terms, it could potentially be challenged. But that it would take months and a lawyer willing to take on Silas Crane and money he paused, a fraction. "That money you probably don't have." She said, "I don't." He said, "No." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of cattle and the wind in the grass. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "Because your father was a fair man and he didn't deserve what was done to him. And because Harlan Brock has been taking from this county for 12 years and I am tired of watching it happen." It was a longer speech than she suspected he made often. He seemed slightly uncomfortable with it himself. She said, "I need $4,200 in less than 2 months. I have $900 at best from the cattle sale. I need a plan." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you offering to be part of that plan?" He looked out the window at the long sweep of his land. He said slowly, "I could buy the cattle at a premium. I can pay you $1,200 instead of the $900 you get at the railhead, and that doesn't cost me anything I can't spare. That still leaves you $3,000 short." She said, "What else?" He said, "I know a lawyer in Wichita who isn't afraid of Silas Crane, man named Archer. If the modification can be challenged, He's the one who can do it, but he'll want a retainer and he'll need time. She said, "What else?" He looked back at her. He said, "The bank's board has 4 members. Brock controls 2 of them. The other 2 are men who came to this county for different reasons than Brock and who might, if they understood what was happening in legal terms clear enough to embarrass them, be inclined to extend the mortgage timeline to allow a challenge to proceed. But someone would have to make that case to them." She said, "Who would make it?" He said, "I would." He said it without ceremony. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Why would you put yourself against Harlan Brock for a ranch that isn't yours?" He was quiet. He said finally, "Because it's the right thing to do." She believed him. She also knew, sitting at his heavy table in his sparse, grief-ordered house, that there was something else underneath that answer, something he was not yet going to say and that she was not yet going to ask about. She said, "All right, Owen Hunter, let's figure this out." The 6 weeks that followed were the most complicated of Nora Donnelly's life, and they were also, she would later think, the most alive she had ever felt. She rode to Wichita with Gus as escort and met the lawyer Archer, a lean, sharp-faced man in his 40s, who read the mortgage modification document with the focused intensity of someone translating a language he finds offensive, and who told her that he believed the modification was signed under false pretenses, that her father had been presented with documents he could not fully read in his final weeks of illness, that the terms had been misrepresented to him, and that while proving this in court would be a battle, it was not an unwinnable one. He named his retainer. She agreed to it and spent 3 days sick with the arithmetic of how she would manage it. She came back to Caldwell and found Owen Hunter had already spoken to the 2 independent bank board members, brothers named Calvin and Thomas Woodward, who had come to Caldwell County from Ohio in 1873 to farm wheat, and had found themselves on the bank's board through a series of community appointments that they now seemed faintly bewildered by. Owen had laid out for them, calmly and completely, the pattern of what Harlan Brock had done and was doing, and Calvin Woodward, who was the older and more decisive of the 2, had gone white around the mouth and called an emergency board meeting for the following week. Brock, predictably, was furious. He was a large man with the kind of careful grooming that announced wealth, and he had the cold eyes of someone who had never once doubted his own right to take what he wanted. He came to Nora's ranch on a Thursday. She heard him from inside and came to the door before he knocked, and he stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and the threat barely concealed beneath the surface of his offer. He said the bank would be patient if she was reasonable. He said the Donnelly land was suitable for certain purposes, water rights, expansion, and that a woman alone with a small herd and a difficult mortgage was not well positioned for the long term. He said he could make the debt disappear in exchange for a fair sale price, and he could also ensure she left Caldwell with enough to start fresh somewhere more suitable. Nora stood in the doorway of her father's house and felt fury so clean and cold it was almost like peace, and she said, "I'll give you my answer through my lawyer, Mr. Brock. Ride safely." He looked at her for a moment with eyes that calculated rather than appealed, and then he turned and walked back to his horse, and she watched him ride away, and she was shaking slightly, but she did not think it was fear. Owen Hunter came by the following morning, not because they had arranged it, but because she was beginning to understand he had developed a habit of riding along the fence line that separated their 2 properties. She met him there on Alice in the cool September air. He said, "Brock came to see you." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "He came to see me first." She looked at him. She said, "What did he say to you?" He said, "He told me that involving myself in the Donnelly matter was a mistake I would not recover from, and that there were ways to make 1,200 acres of ranch land very uncomfortable to operate if the neighbors were uncooperative." She said, "He threatened you." He said he tried to. He said it with a flat simplicity that made it clear the effort had failed to find purchase. She said, "Owen, this is my fight. You don't have to," he said. "It stopped being only your fight when he threatened the Hesslers and I said nothing, and when he drove the Ramirez family off their land and I did nothing. He said it firmly, not harshly, but with the weight of a decision already settled. He said, I have the resources to make it difficult for him and the history to have a reason, and I am going to use both. She looked at him in the morning light, at the strong, worn lines of his face, and something shifted inside her that she was not immediately prepared to name. She said, "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet." Things grew difficult with the speed of a prairie fire. Harlan Brock, with the tactical efficiency of a man who had done this before, began to apply pressure through every available channel. He had a word with the men who employed the seasonal cowboys Gus Whitfield had counted on to help with the Donnelly roundup, and 3 of the 4 agreed, with apologies, that they would not be available after all. He had Silas Crane send a letter to the circuit court, questioning the standing of the lawyer Archer to practice in Caldwell County on technical grounds that Archer dismissed as frivolous, but which would require a formal response that would consume time. He spread a story through Caldwell's social circles, through the men who drank at the Lone Star Saloon and the women who passed information through church committees, that Nora Donnelly was in financial difficulties of her own making, that her father's poor stewardship had left the ranch in a condition that made it a burden to the county, that she was inexperienced and unsuited to the enterprise. Nora heard all of this because Caldwell was small enough that nothing stayed private for long, and she felt the particular sting of watching a false story take hold in a community she was still trying to join. She also felt, with a precision that surprised her, exactly who believed it and who did not. Owen Hunter did not believe a word of it. He made this clear in the methodical way he made everything clear, not through dramatic declarations but through actions that required a choice. When her roundup crew fell through, he appeared on a Monday morning with 3 of his own hands and spent 2 days helping move the Donnelly cattle without being asked and without discussing payment. When the formal challenge to Archer's standing was filed, Owen made 2 trips to the circuit court himself, once to file a supporting affidavit about the conditions under which Patrick Donnelly had signed the mortgage modification, and once to give testimony before Judge Carter about the pattern of behavior he had witnessed over 12 years. Nora spent those weeks working harder than she had ever worked in her life, learning the land and the cattle, managing the ledgers her father had left in mild disorder, corresponding with Archer in Wichita, and navigating the social landscape of Caldwell with the careful attention of someone who understood that reputation was a form of currency she could not afford to waste. She also, in the odd hours and the quiet evenings, began to understand Owen Hunter. It happened gradually, the way true understanding always happens, through accumulation rather than revelation. She learned that he rose before dawn and worked until the light failed, and that this was not discipline but necessity, the ranch demanding everything he had and him giving it without complaint. She learned that he had a way of saying more with silence than most men said with words, that when he was troubled he cleaned and organized his tool shed with the focused intensity of someone trying to impose order on something that resisted it. She learned that he read actual books, not just ledgers, historical works, and a battered collected Shakespeare that lived on the shelf next to his law books, and that this surprised people and did not surprise her at all. She learned, one evening in late September when she had stayed late at the Broken H kitchen going over land survey documents by lamplight, that he had loved his wife with a depth that had left a wound in him when she died that he had not tried to heal because healing it would have felt to him like a betrayal of what they had been to each other. She did not learn this because he told her. She learned it because she asked him, carefully and directly, why he had no portrait of Clara in the house, only that small daguerreotype, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said that looking at her face too often made the rest of the day feel like something he was merely surviving rather than living, and that he had found it easier to keep the picture small and keep himself moving. She said, "Easier, or just what you know how to do." He looked at her across the lamplight with something in his face that was startled and unguarded and completely at odds with his usual containment, and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, quietly, "Both, probably." She nodded. She went back to the survey documents, but something had changed in the room between them, some permeable shift that made the space feel different, warmer, and they were both aware of it and neither addressed it because they were too busy fighting to save her land, and the time for addressing it had not yet arrived. Brock made his most consequential move in the second week of October. He went to the bank board and called for an emergency meeting to accelerate the foreclosure proceeding, citing an interpretation of the mortgage terms that Archer had specifically and publicly challenged. He brought Silas Crane, who produced a legal argument that was technically complex and practically designed to confuse the Woodward brothers enough that they would abstain from a decisive vote. Brock also brought, without notice or precedent, a man from Topeka named Whitmore who claimed to represent the State Banking Commission, and who suggested, with careful vagueness, that there were concerns about the management of the Donnelly property and the county's interest in resolving the debt swiftly. Nora was not at the board meeting. She learned about it 2 hours afterward from Calvin Woodward, who came to her ranch with his hat in his hands and the gray look of a man who has been maneuvered into a corner. He said the vote had been 3-1 in favor of proceeding with foreclosure proceedings. He said he had voted against. He said his brother Thomas had abstained. He said he was sorry, and he meant it. Nora thanked him and walked him to his horse, and then she stood in the yard of her father's ranch and looked at the cottonwood trees and the fading October light and felt, for the first time, the real possibility that she was going to lose. She rode to the Broken H. Owen came to the door when he heard the hooves and read her face in a single glance, and stepped back to let her in and put the kettle on the stove without a word, the way a person does things when they understand the shape of another person's distress, and do not try to prematurely fill it with words. She told him what Calvin Woodward had told her. She was precise and controlled and completely factual, and she managed to stay that way through the entire recounting, and then she was done and she sat at his table with her hands wrapped around the cup he had placed in front of her and she said, "I think he might win." Owen sat across from her. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Archer says the court challenge has merit. The hearing is in 3 weeks," she said. 3 weeks is after the foreclosure deadline. He said, "I know," she said, "Owen. If the hearing happens but the foreclosure proceeds first, the property changes hands before the court can rule. That's the trap, isn't it? He's been building toward that timing all along." He said, "Yes," she said, "then we're out of options." He said, "Not quite." He was looking at the table. He had the expression of a man approaching a decision that has been developing slowly in him for some time, and that he has not yet let himself fully face. He said, "There is one thing that could change the legal and financial picture fast enough to matter." She looked at him. She waited. He said, "If the Donnelly property and the Broken H were joined as a single holding, under a single title, the mortgage against the Donnelly parcel would effectively be absorbed into the combined asset value, and the bank's legal grounds for foreclosure would become contestable on entirely different terms. It would buy Archer the time he needs for the court challenge." She was very still. She said, "How would the properties be joined?" He looked up at her. He said, "Marriage." The word fell into the kitchen like a stone into still water, and the rings of it spread outward in the silence. She said after a long moment, "You're proposing to me." He said, "I'm explaining the legal mechanism," but his voice was not quite steady. She said, "Owen." He said, "It would be a practical arrangement. You would keep the ranch. Your father's land would be secured. Brock would lose his leverage. Archer could." She said, "Stop." He stopped. She said, "Are you marrying me to save my land, or are you saving my land to give yourself a reason to marry me?" The kitchen was absolutely silent. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and she saw him make a choice. She saw it in the precise moment he made it, the moment he stopped calculating and simply let the truth come up through the floor of all his careful restraint. He said, "Both." He said it quietly. He said, "I know that's not a simple thing to say. I know I know I'm not an easy man. And I know you came here to save your father's land on your own terms and not to be rescued by a gruff neighbor who has been finding reasons to ride the fence line between your property and mine for 6 weeks." He stopped. He said, "But both." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "Give me 2 days." He said, "All right." She rode home under a sky that was going dark at the edges with the first real cold of the year, and she spent 2 days not evading the question but meeting it fully, turning it in every direction, looking at all its faces. She thought about the prairie she had seen from the stagecoach window on the way in, and how it had made her feel like the world was larger than her grief. She thought about the fence line and the repaired posts, and the coffee at the heavy table and the lamplight, and the 2 days of his ranch hands working her roundup without payment or ceremony. She thought about what he had said, that it had stopped being only her fight, and how those words had changed something in the architecture of what she understood about him. She thought about the dark-eyed man who kept a picture small because looking at it too much made the rest of the day feel like mere survival, and she thought about the fact that he had been riding the fence line for 6 weeks, and that this was not the behavior of a man who was indifferent. She thought about love. She thought about what she had felt in the lamplight when he said both. She thought about what that word had cost him and what it meant that he had said it. On the morning of the second day she rode to the Broken H, and he was at the fence between their properties, which was where she had been half expecting to find him, and she pulled Alice up and looked at him across the wire. She said, "Yes." He looked at her. Something in his face changed in a way that suggested the past 6 weeks of careful, practical, well-organized effort had been covering something much simpler and much more urgent than property rights. He said, "Yes." She said, "We do this together." All of it, the ranch, the legal fight, everything. "Not me being absorbed into your property, together," he said. "That's what I want." He said it without hesitation. She said, "And Owen, this is not only a legal strategy." She said it as clearly as she had said anything in her life. He said, "No, it's not." He met her eyes and held them, and in those dark, serious eyes she saw something she recognized, the same thing she had been feeling for several weeks and refusing to call by its right name. "It hasn't been only a legal strategy since approximately the third time I found a reason to ride this fence line." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, bright and genuine in the cold air, and it seemed to surprise him too, and he smiled. And his smile was rare enough that seeing it felt like watching a closed door open to reveal a room full of light. They rode to Reverend Marsh together that same afternoon and arranged the reading of banns, which was the required first step before a marriage could be performed in the church's view, and Reverend Marsh, who was a good man if a somewhat startled one, agreed to read the first bann the following Sunday. This was where Harlan Brock entered the story again. Brock heard as he heard everything, through the network of people who were afraid of him or obligated to him or both, that Owen Hunter and Nora Donnelly intended to marry. He heard it within 24 hours of their visit to Reverend Marsh. And he understood immediately what it meant for the foreclosure strategy he had so carefully constructed. He sent Silas Crane to Owen Hunter with a message that was structured as legal advice and functioned as a threat. The message suggested that the proposed marriage might be construed, in light of the pending bank proceeding, as an attempt to fraudulently transfer assets in advance of a debt resolution, and that this could expose both parties to significant legal jeopardy. Crane delivered this message on a Friday morning. Owen read the message, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and told Crane to leave his property. Then he rode to Nora's ranch and showed her the letter and said, "Brock is going to try to stop the marriage or delay it past the foreclosure deadline." She read the letter. She said, "This is not a legitimate legal threat. Archer would tell him so in about 4 minutes." He said, "Archer would tell him so in about 2. But Brock's goal isn't a legitimate legal threat. His goal is to make us hesitate long enough that the deadline passes." She looked at him. She said, then we don't hesitate. He said the banns take 3 Sundays to read. That's standard, that's 3 weeks. The foreclosure deadline is in, she said, 17 days. He said, yes. She said, can Reverend Marsh waive the 3-week reading? He said, he can issue a marriage license directly if there is sufficient cause to dispense with the reading of banns. He would have to sign an ecclesiastical affidavit of special circumstances. She said, would he? Owen said, I don't know. He's a man of procedure. But I think if the circumstances were explained to him completely, he might find that Christian charity and procedural requirements can occasionally coexist. They went to Reverend Marsh on Saturday morning. They explained the complete situation to him. The mortgage, the modification, the pattern of Brock's actions in the county, the Hessler family and the Ramirez family and what had happened to both of them, the legal challenge pending in Wichita, the foreclosure deadline, and the precise mechanism by which the marriage would protect Nora's property in time for the court challenge to proceed. Reverend Marsh listened. He was a thin man with careful eyes and the slightly dusty look of someone who spent most of his time between book covers, and he took notes in the margin of a small notebook while they talked, and when they were finished, he was quiet for a long time. He said, Miss Donnelly, do you understand that what you are proposing is a marriage? Not an arrangement, not a business partnership, but a marriage in the eyes of God and the community with all the permanence that implies. She said, yes, Reverend, I understand exactly what it is. He looked at Owen. He said, and you, Mr. Hunter, you are not acting from pity or from a sense of obligation that could become resentment in the years ahead. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Reverend, I am acting from the first genuine desire I have felt in 3 years to be in the same room with another person, for longer than it takes to conclude a piece of business. I would not call that pity. Reverend Marsh looked at both of them for a long time. Then he said, I will issue the license. The ceremony can be performed next Sunday, provided you both present yourselves at the church with 2 witnesses and your signatures on the application before Wednesday noon. They had the signatures in by Tuesday afternoon. Now the days between Tuesday and Sunday moved with a strange quality that Nora would later try to describe and never quite manage. There was no dramatic change in the texture of their days. They were both still working, she at the ranch and he at the Broken H, corresponding with Archer, managing the roundup that had been completed with Owen's help, watching the movements of Harlan Brock's people with the careful attention of people who know they are in the final stretch of a hard race. But there was something different between them, some permeable warmth that had been there in the lamplight and the fence line and the coffee at the heavy table, and was now something that did not have to pretend to be something else. He came to her ranch on Thursday evening, not for any practical reason she could identify, and she did not ask for one, and they sat on the porch in the October dusk, and she made coffee and they talked about things that were not the mortgage. She asked about his years in Virginia during the war, and he told her about them slowly, in the way people tell things that are not meant for frequent repetition, and she listened with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. She told him about St. Louis and about her mother, who had died when she was 15, and about how the loss of her mother was what had made her understand that grief was not a temporary condition but a permanent addition to the self, and that this understanding was what made her capable, she thought, of being honest about difficult things. He listened the way he always listened, with complete attention and without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "You are one of the most honest people I have ever met." She said, "Is that a compliment or an observation?" He said, "Both." And he said it with a slight warmth in his voice that made the word ring differently than it had the first time he used it. And they looked at each other across the porch in the October dusk, and the air between them was full of something warm and serious and entirely mutual. He left before full dark, which was proper, and she stood on the porch watching him ride toward his own land and felt something she had not expected to feel in Kansas, felt it clearly, without qualification, and let herself feel it. Sunday arrived. She woke early and dressed with care in the best dress she owned, a dark green wool that had belonged to a life infant. Louis that felt very far away now, and she pinned her hair and looked at herself in the small mirror in her father's bedroom, and said quietly to the woman looking back at her, "All right." Owen was waiting outside the church when she arrived with Gus as her escort. He had combed his hair and worn his good coat, and he looked like himself except slightly more deliberate, the way people look when they have made a conscious decision to be present rather than merely moving through a space. He offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked into the church together. The congregation was seated. Reverend Marsh was at his pulpit. The service was already in its early stages, the weekly liturgy that preceded the main sermon, and Nora took her place in the second pew and Owen took a seat near the back because there was no space beside her, and this was a Sunday service, not yet a ceremony, and the plan was that Reverend Marsh would announce at the appropriate moment that the marriage ceremony would follow the service. That was the plan. What actually happened was that Harlan Brock arrived at the church at 5 minutes past the service's beginning, and he took a seat in the front pew, and he turned once to look at Nora with the specific expression of a man who believes he has one more card to play, and she felt a cold thread of dread move through her, sharp and certain, because she did not know what the card was. She found out 17 minutes into the service. Brock rose from his pew. He addressed Reverend Marsh directly, interrupting the reading with the calm presumption of a man who believed his voice took priority over proceedings he had not organized. He said that he had, in his capacity as principal creditor of the Donnelly estate, a statement to make to the community before any ceremony of any kind was performed, and he produced a document from his coat and began to read from it. The document, and this was the dark past making itself known, the hidden motive coming fully to the surface, claimed that the proposed marriage between Nora Donnelly and Owen Hunter was a fraudulent transaction designed to evade a legitimate debt, and that Nora Donnelly had, in fact, never had legal standing to inherit the Donnelly property at all, because Patrick Donnelly had, according to a document Brock now produced, signed a deed of partial transfer to the Caldwell Savings and Trust 6 months before his death, which Brock claimed superseded her inheritance entirely. The church went very quiet. Nora felt the impact of those words the way you feel a blow, the immediate numbness before the pain arrives, and she sat very still and she thought with rapid precision. The deed. She had never seen any such deed. Archer had never mentioned it. It had not appeared in any of the estate documents. It had not been disclosed during the mortgage proceedings. It had not been mentioned by Silas Crane in any of his communications, because it had not existed until Brock needed it to exist. She knew with absolute certainty, in the same instant she processed what Brock had said, that the document he was holding was false. She also knew in the next instant that knowing it was false and being able to prove it in time to stop it were two very different things. She rose from her pew. She turned to face the congregation, the 80 assembled neighbors, the widow Hanratty, the Woodward brothers, the families she had been meeting for 6 weeks, the community she had been trying to join, and she opened her mouth to speak. She did not get the chance, because Owen Hunter had already risen from his seat at the back of the church. And he was walking down the center aisle, and he spoke her name, Nora Donnelly. She turned and looked at him, and he stopped 3 feet from her pew, and the entire church held its breath, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that were not contained at all anymore, that were open and certain and absolutely unafraid, and he said 4 more words. "I intend to marry you." He said it to Nora, but every person in the room heard it. He said it loudly enough for the full congregation, for Brock, for Reverend Marsh, for the widow Hanratty, for Calvin and Thomas Woodward, for every man and woman who had been watching this situation develop for 6 weeks with the helpless discomfort of people who know something wrong is happening and are not sure what to do about it. And then he turned to Harlan Brock, and in the same voice, that low, rough, irrevocable voice that did not ask permission, he said, That document you're holding is a forgery, Brock. Patrick Donnelly's hand tremor from his illness is visible in every legal signature he made after June of this year, and the signature on whatever you're holding is steady as a man in perfect health. Archer has a handwriting analysis already prepared. Judge Carter has been notified. And Calvin Woodward, who sits on your bank's own board, is prepared to testify that no partial deed transfer was ever disclosed in any board communication, which means either it doesn't exist in any legitimate banking record or it was created outside the bank's own processes. He paused. He said, both of those things are crimes. Brock's face had gone a careful blank, but his hands, Nora noticed, were not quite steady. Owen turned back to Reverend Marsh. He said, Reverend, you have a license in your desk that entitles you to perform a marriage ceremony for me and Nora Donnelly today. I would like to proceed. Reverend Marsh stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. She said, yes, please. The Reverend opened his desk. What followed was not a quiet ceremony. It was performed in front of 80 witnesses who had come expecting a Sunday service and found themselves participants in something considerably more dramatic, and it had the quality of an event that people would talk about for the rest of their lives. Harlan Brock sat in the front pew for the first 5 minutes of it with the expression of a man doing urgent calculations, and then he stood and walked out of the church, and the sound of the door closing behind him was, in its way, a kind of answer. Calvin Woodward stood as a witness. The widow Hanratty, whose actual name was Bernadette, wept openly and with apparent satisfaction. Owen Hunter stood beside Nora Donnelly at the front of that church and spoke the vows in the same steady voice he used for everything. Not performative, not theatrical, but real, absolutely real. The way his hands were real when he took hers, and the way his eyes were real when he looked at her. Open in a way she had watched them open gradually over 6 weeks, until she understood that she had been watching the slow return of a man to himself. She spoke her own vows in a voice that was clear and unhesitating, and full of the particular quality of things she meant with all of herself. And she watched his face while she spoke them and saw, in the lines of it, the same thing she had seen on the porch in the October dusk, something warm and serious and entirely mutual. Reverend Marsh pronounced them married. Owen Hunter kissed his wife with a gentleness that surprised everyone in the room, including, she suspected, himself. The congregation applauded. The legal aftermath moved quickly, and with the momentum of things that have been building for a long time and finally find their release. Archer came from Wichita the following Tuesday with his handwriting analysis and his challenge to the mortgage modification, and a letter from a state banking commissioner who turned out to be a real one, as opposed to Brock's invented variety, and who had been watching the activities of the Caldwell Savings and Trust Company with professional interest for some time. The forged deed was examined and found to be exactly what Owen had said it was, the signature on it clear and steady where Patrick Donnelly's hand in his final months had been anything but. Silas Crane, confronted with the evidence in a formal proceeding before Judge Carter, made the decision that men in his position often make when the alternative is personal criminal liability, and he provided testimony about the full scope of Brock's land acquisition scheme in exchange for a reduced charge. Harlan Brock was arrested on a Friday afternoon in early November. He was charged with fraud, forgery, and the criminal modification of legal documents in 3 separate land cases: the Hessler case, the Ramirez case, and the Donnelly case. The legal proceedings against him would take months, but he was removed from his position at the Caldwell Savings and Trust immediately, and the board, now operating under Calvin Woodward's steadier guidance, agreed to return the Donnelly mortgage to its original terms, with the modification set aside pending the final court ruling. Nora and Owen paid the original mortgage amount over time, comfortably, from the combined operation of their 2 ranches. The Donnelly property and the Broken H ran as adjacent but distinct operations for the first year. She managed hers. He managed his, and they worked together on the overlap with the easy coordination of people who think alike about land. The house they lived in together was Owen's, because it was larger, but they rode to her father's ranch nearly every day. And gradually the small sodden timber house became something it had not been in Patrick Donnelly's lifetime. A place that hummed with intention and care, because Nora was always fixing something, improving something, extending the garden or mending the porch, or painting the barn the deep red that she had decided on some wordless instinct was the right color for it. The first months of their marriage had the texture of two people discovering each other without the emergency of circumstance to absorb their full attention, and this was its own kind of revelation. She found that he was funnier than he appeared, quietly and unexpectedly, the humor surfacing in the oblique way that all his inner life surfaced, without announcement. He found that she had opinions about everything, and that he was, to his own considerable surprise, interested in every single one of them. They argued sometimes, the practical, energetic arguments of two people who are not afraid of each other and who have different but complementary certainties, and the arguments were always about something concrete: a fencing decision, a cattle purchase, a plan for the spring, and they resolved them the way they resolved everything, by thinking together until they found the thing that was actually right. What happened in the quiet of their shared house in the first autumn of their marriage was something she had not known to expect, a kind of peace that was not emptiness but fullness, the particular satisfaction of being deeply known by someone who had chosen, with full information and clear eyes, to stay. She watched Owen Hunter uncalcify, gradually and unmistakably, the hardness of his 3 years of deliberate solitude softening into something that was still strong, but was no longer defended against softness itself. He moved the daguerreotype of Clara to the mantel in the main room, where it had light. She did not comment on this, but she saw him do it, and she understood what it meant, that he was no longer managing his grief by containing it, but was learning to carry it as part of a life that had room for more than only pain. He told her about Clara, properly, in the winter evenings by the fire, the full story of them, the young man he had been before the war, the marriage in 1873, the 8 years they had worked and built and hoped. He told it without the protective minimalism he had used before, and she listened with the same quality of attention she brought to things that mattered, and she asked questions that were gentle and real, and he answered them, and the telling was something he needed, she thought, the way winter ground needs to be worked and aerated before it can hold the spring. She told him about the young man she had loved in St. Louis, briefly and incompletely, a clerk in her uncle's office who had been pleasant and undemanding and ultimately uninterested in the kind of life she actually wanted to live. She told it with the mild, clear-eyed retrospection of someone who is grateful for what didn't work because of where the path led instead, and Owen listened and then said, he was a fool, with such simple conviction that she laughed and said he was being uncharitable, and he said, yes, with zero apparent willingness to revise. Winter in Caldwell County was hard and clean and genuine, the kind of cold that required real preparation and real effort, and they met it together with the particular pleasure of people who have discovered that hardship shared is a form of intimacy. She learned to do things she had never done: bank a fire properly for the night, read the sky for weather, judge cattle health from a distance. He learned to let himself be helped, which was harder for him than anything physical, and to trust her judgment on the things she knew better than he did, which were more things than his initial assessment had suggested. By the time the spring came and the grass went green again, and the courts had finished their proceedings against Harlan Brock, convicted on 2 of the 3 charges, sentenced, the Caldwell Savings and Trust reorganized under new management, the Ramirez family's case reopened for review. Nora and Owen Hunter had been married for 6 months, and they were something that neither of them had planned for, and both of them had arrived at with the thoroughness of people who do not do things by halves. They were, without any drama or announcement, deeply in love with each other. She told him so on an April evening when the windows were open and the air smelled of new grass and the creek was running high with snowmelt. And she said it the same way she said everything, directly, completely, without qualifying softness. He looked at her across the room for a moment with those dark eyes, and then he crossed the room and took her face in his hands, rough hands, careful and deliberate as everything he did. And he said, "I know. I've been in love with you since you told me on your own porch that it stopped being only about the ranch the day I started riding the fence line, and you said it before I did." She said, "I said that," he said, "not in those words." "But you said it." She thought about it. She said, "I suppose I did." He kissed her, not with the gentleness of their wedding in front of 80 witnesses, but with the warmth and certainty of a man who is at home in what he's doing and knows it. Spring deepened into summer, and summer was good. The cattle were healthy, the grass was strong, the ranch operations hummed. Gus Whitfield, who had concluded at some point in the winter that Nora Donnelly Hunter was probably the most effective person he had ever worked for, and that he would be a fool to seek employment elsewhere, extended his tenure without being asked, and hired 2 additional hands with her agreement. The fence between the Donnelly property and the Broken H was repaired thoroughly, post by post, and then, with the casual logic of 2 operations becoming more integrated, several sections of it were removed entirely to allow the combined cattle to move between the 2 pastures more efficiently. The 3 cottonwood trees in the yard of her father's ranch grew taller. She planted a 4th. They rode together every morning when the work permitted it, across both properties, checking the fence lines and the cattle and the creek levels and all the 100 small vital things that a ranch requires of the people who love it. And these morning rides had a particular quality of completeness. The 2 of them, and the wide land and the sky and the horses and the conversation that ranged across everything, and nothing the way conversation does between people who have decided to spend their lives talking to each other. She was, by the following spring, expecting their first child. She told him on a morning in February when the light was thin and cold and beautiful, and his face underwent a transformation that she had never seen on it before, and that she knew she would remember with exactness for the rest of her life. Something that moved through him from his chest outward, something that had the texture of joy so large it required a moment to be contained. He sat down in the nearest chair, which was not his usual response to news, and she stood in front of him, and he put his hands on her waist and rested his forehead against her collarbone and stayed there for a moment very still, and she stroked his hair and did not say anything because words were not the right instrument for what was happening in that room. He said finally into her collarbone, "A child," she said, "our child." He looked up at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. He said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" She said, "I am entirely well. I am also going to need you to stop looking at me as if I might break right now, because we both know that is not how this is going to go." He laughed. The laugh was real and full, and it moved the whole room the way his rare smiles moved rooms. He said, "No, I don't suppose it is." He was not overprotective, but he was attentive in the specific and practical ways that mattered. He took over the fence work that required heavy lifting without making a declaration about it. He ensured the kitchen was always stocked with the things she needed. He asked Gus to ride with her when Owen himself could not. He wrote to Wichita for a medical reference and found a doctor willing to make the journey to Caldwell for the birth. He did all of this with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, without drama or ceremony, and she loved him for it with the particular quality of love that comes from being taken seriously. The Woodward brothers, who had become friends by this point, Calvin especially, who had a directness Nora appreciated through a celebration of the pregnancy that was also, somewhat tangentially, a celebration of the county's legal resolution, and the fact that the Caldwell Savings and Trust now operated under a board that actually read the documents it signed. The widow Bernadette Hanratty baked an extraordinary cake. Reverend Marsh gave a short speech about the rewards of community virtue that was warm and genuine and only slightly self-congratulatory. The child born in October of that second year was a boy. They named him Patrick for her father. Owen held him in the first hour with the focused, complete attention he brought to things he valued most highly, and he looked at this boy dark eyes like his father, and the determined set of a mouth that was going to be exactly like his mother's. And he said quietly to Nora, "He's going to be impossible." She said, "Absolutely," with great satisfaction. Patrick Donnelly Hunter was, indeed, a child of strong opinions and early vocabulary, and an absolute conviction that all interesting things were located at the highest point of whatever surface was available. He was adored by Gus Whitfield, who pretended to be put upon by him, and was obviously and completely charmed. He was spoiled lavishly by Bernadette Hanratty. He was carried on horseback by his father before he could walk properly and showed, from infancy, the particular comfort with large animals that suggested he had been born knowing something about them. He grew up on the combined ranch like a plant in good soil, strong and certain, and with a clear orientation toward the light. 2 years after Patrick came a daughter, whom they named Ellen, for Owen's mother, and Ellen was quieter than her brother and infinitely more observant, and she had her mother's dark auburn hair and her father's directness, and she followed Nora around the ranch from the moment she could walk with the focused attention of someone who has decided to learn everything that person knows. And 2 years after Ellen came another son, James, who had the easy temperament of someone the world has treated well from the beginning, and who laughed at almost everything, and was consequently loved by everyone who met him. 3 children, and 2 ranches, and the long Kansas seasons, and all the 100 daily, ordinary, extraordinary things that make up a life. The Ramirez family, whose case had been reopened in the wake of Brock's conviction, reached a partial resolution in 1884, receiving compensation from the bank's reorganized assets that was not full justice but was something, and Nora wrote to their advocate in Wichita to express her support, and offered the Donnelly East pasture as seasonal grazing for 2 years at no cost, while they reestablished. Owen did not comment on this decision when she made it. He simply adjusted the grazing schedule accordingly. She found this response to be one of the most eloquent things she had ever witnessed. The Hessler family had moved to Missouri, and that was a thing that had already happened and could not be undone. But Calvin Woodward sent them a letter on behalf of the bank's new board acknowledging the circumstances of their forced sale and offering a modest reparation from the reorganized assets. And it was something if not enough, and the doing of it mattered regardless. Caldwell continued to grow and change around them, the cattle drives thinning as the railroad expanded, and the economics of the industry shifted, the town adapting with the pragmatic creativity of a place that had survived other changes before. The First Methodist Church got a new bell in 1885. The school expanded to 2 rooms. A newspaper started up, edited by a woman named Julia Marsh, who was the Reverend's daughter and had views about the territorial future of southern Kansas that she expressed with great clarity and no apparent concern for whether her readers were prepared for them. Nora wrote for the newspaper sometimes practical pieces about ranch management and water rights, and the legal structures that governed land ownership in the territory, written in the clear, precise prose of someone who had learned these things through necessity and understood their importance. The pieces were read widely and occasionally argued about at considerable length, which was exactly the kind of attention she felt they deserved. Owen Hunter, by 1886, had a reputation in Caldwell County that was entirely different from the one he had carried in 1882. He was still not a gregarious man. He was still direct to the point of occasional abruptness. He was still more comfortable on horseback than in drawing rooms. But the deliberate, grief-enforced solitude had given way to something else, a chosen connection to the community he lived in. He served on the county's land use committee. He served as an informal mediator in disputes between ranchers about water and grazing rights. He attended church with his family every Sunday and sat in the second pew with his wife and children with a settled solidity that expressed more than most men managed with extended declarations. Reverend Marsh, preaching one Sunday on the text about love being a matter of action rather than sentiment, glanced at Owen Hunter in the second pew and gave the smallest nod, and Owen Hunter met his gaze and returned it. And this exchange contained the entire story of what had happened in that church 4 years earlier and what it had become. The fence between the Donnelly property and the Broken H came down entirely in 1887, formalized in a new consolidated land title that combined the two operations under a single deed. The Donnelly Hunter Ranch, 1,250 acres, cattle operation and hay production, water rights on 2 creek segments, assessed value that would have been unimaginable to the young man from Virginia who came to Kansas in 1874 with 200 acres, and a grief he had not yet understood how to carry. The name on the deed was Owen and Nora Hunter. She had kept Donnelly in the property name because it was her father's name on the land, and she intended it to stay there. And Owen had agreed without a moment's hesitation. On the evening they signed the consolidated deed, they sat on the porch of what had been Owen's house and was now simply their house, and the children were inside, and the day was going down in long gold light across the grass. And Nora thought about the day she had stepped off the stagecoach with her carpet bag and her back straight and her jaw set, and her absolute determination to keep a ranch she had never seen. She said, "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you on the fence line at the creek?" "That I was trespassing," she said. "After that," he said, "tell me," she said, "I thought that you were the most self-contained person I had ever seen, and I wondered what it would take to see you surprised." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And now," she said, "now I think you are still the most self-contained person I've ever seen, but I know what surprises you." She paused. "Patrick surprises you, every day. You think you know what he's going to do, and he does something else entirely." He laughed, the full, real laugh that still moved rooms. He said, "He does," she said, "and Ellen surprises you." He said, "Ellen is going to understand this land better than either of us." He said it with a certainty that was not ambition but observation, the flat recognition of a quality he had been watching develop for 4 years. She said, "And James?" He said, "James surprises me by making everything seem easy." He paused. He said, "He got that from you." She looked at him. She said, "I am not easy." He said, "No, but you make hard things look like the natural way of doing them. That's different. He has that." She thought about this. She said, "And I surprise you." He looked at her in the gold October light, and the lines of his face were the familiar lines she had been learning for 5 years. The face of a man who had been made hard by things that were genuinely hard and who had chosen deliberately to let softness back in, not weakness, not the absence of strength, but the choice to be open to what the world offered when the world offered something good. She was the something good. She had always known it, and it still moved her. He said, "Nora, you surprised me from the moment you said, 'That's Donnelly land you're working on,' with that particular tone that meant you were going to fight for it with everything you had, and you were already running the calculations on how." He paused. "You have not stopped surprising me once since then." She said, "Good," with deep satisfaction. He said, "Yes," with the same warmth she had heard in his voice the first time he said that word to her, across a fence line in the October air. Inside the house, Patrick had knocked something over. There was a thud and the raised voice of Gus, who was babysitting tonight with the resigned dedication of a man who has discovered too late that he genuinely loves these children. And Ellen's clear voice was explaining something to someone, probably James, in the patient tutorial tone of a 4-year-old who has opinions about how things should be organized. Owen stood and offered Nora his hand, and she took it, and they went inside together, into the warm lamplight and the noise and the beautiful, ordinary, hard-won chaos of their life, and the door closed behind them on the October evening, and the cottonwood trees in the yard stood against the darkening sky, and the grass rolled away toward the east across 1,250 acres of land that no one would ever take from them again. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her father's calendar still on the wall. She had never taken it down, had added to it year by year, a new calendar pinned below the old one, and then another and another, the whole story of the ranch's life layered there, and she wrote a letter. She wrote to the Ramirez family, who had been rebuilding in the territory with what they had managed to recover, and she wrote in the warm, direct voice she brought to everything she meant, and she told them about the consolidation of the ranch deeds and the good cattle season, and the 3 children and the way the east pasture looked in the fall light, and she invited them to come and see it, whenever they were able, because the land remembered people who had cared for it even when those people were gone. And she thought they might want to see what the land had become. She sealed the letter and set it by the door to be posted, and she looked at her father's handwriting on the calendar, July entries trailing off mid-month, and she said quietly to the room, to the man who had planted cottonwood trees and written letters full of exuberant hope and left his daughter a ranch and a mortgage and a direction, "I kept it, Papa. We kept it." Owen came into the kitchen then, having finished the last round of checking the livestock, and he saw her face and understood, without asking, what moment he had walked into, and he put his hands on her shoulders, and she put her hand over one of his, and they were still together for a moment in the kitchen of the ranch that had been built with hope and saved with love, and the lamp burned steady on the table, and the October wind moved through the cottonwood trees in the yard. And everything was resolved, and everything was settled, and everything, after all of it, was well. The Donnelly Hunter ranch ran for the rest of their long lives, and into their children's lives after that. Patrick became a rancher with his father's patience and his mother's stubbornness and his own easy originality. Ellen became a lawyer, one of the first women to pass the bar in Kansas, and practiced land rights law with a focus and precision that people found either formidable or brilliant depending on whether she was working for or against them. James became a teacher and then a school principal, and was universally beloved in a way that he found slightly embarrassing and was never quite able to stop. Owen Hunter did not become a church-going man in the uncomplicated sense. He remained someone for whom belief was a serious matter rather than a social one, and he expressed it through the daily work of living rightly in the world rather than through declarations. But he went to church every Sunday with his family, and he sat in the second pew, and every time the light came through the tall windows at that particular angle and fell across the room, he thought about the morning he had walked down the center aisle and spoken 4 words that changed the entire direction of his life, and he thought about Nora rising from her pew to meet him, and he thought about what courage looked like when it was quiet and when it was loud, and he was grateful with the deep, full, unhurried gratitude of a man who knows what he has for all of it. Nora Donnelly Hunter lived on her father's land for the rest of her life, and she was buried, when the time came, in the churchyard of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell beside Owen Hunter, who had gone 3 years before her, and whose death she had met with the same quality she brought to everything difficult. Directly, completely, without pretending it was other than what it was, while remaining, quietly and absolutely, herself. On the headstone they shared, because she had arranged this in advance, with the same practical thoroughness she brought to all arrangements, were their 2 names, and the dates and forewords that anyone who had been in Caldwell, Kansas in October of 1882 would have recognized immediately. The words were, "He spoke her name," and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything.